Take a car with a CB and go. Now. I won't let you down. She froze for a second, letting it sink in. She threw on her vest and added the Glock and mags to it, and then selected her carbine with a scope. 4 magazines were charged ready, and she seated one in the weapon before adding the others to her vest. She still had the loaded Walther and a spare magazine on her left hip. She also carried a hidden sheath knife inside her trousers by her kidneys. A short blade, more of a punch knife really. The really disturbing thing about all of this was that she knew how to use them all. If any Kelvin Parks had tried to abduct this girl, he would have been found piece by piece over the course of a few years. She opened the cabinet where they kept the spare keys to the vehicles, those brand new ones they had found, that was, and threw herself in Steve's Defender. She fired up the engine and accelerated hard up the driveway. "At the motorway," came the young voice over the crackling radio. Dan snatched up the mic. "Hard right, down the slit, then back on yourself. Go fast until you find me, then tuck in behind me," he instructed. "Roger," came the reply. Almost 15 agonizing minutes later, she caught sight of the back of Dan's big Discovery cruising along. She called him to say she had him in sight, and he explained what he wanted her to do. "Next vehicle up ahead is possible hostile. Match speed and force a stop on them. Then you go ahead and stop the one in front," he said. "Confirm you want me to force stop on hostiles and then chase the other one?" she asked. "Yes," he said clearly. "Negative. You have Marie on board. You force stop, and I'll deal with hostiles," she countered. Dan nearly threw the mic in sheer exasperation. She was right, really, and was only doing what he would do. She had tried so hard to be like him that she now was him, and he hated it. He looked at Marie for help. "You made her a child soldier. You deal with it," she said with amusement to cover her rising fear. Dan shook his head at her and tried again. "Negative. You are to assist in forcing a stop and then—" He stopped talking as the vehicle in front started to speed away. "Change of plan. We've been made. Take out hostiles now," he yelled into the radio as he accelerated hard, kicking the automatic gearbox down twice. Marie pressed herself into her seat and looked frightened. He leaned over and opened the glove compartment, exposing a SIG and 2 spare magazines. She stared wide-eyed at him. The 2 men in the car saw the flash of movement as the Discovery crested the rise behind them too close. They never knew that the driver was distracted by a radio argument with a young girl, but their plans were forced into early execution by the intrusion. They planned to follow her to the blockage up ahead and trap her. Both were concerned it was some kind of government team. A second black 4x4 appeared next to the first, and they were coming hard at them. The girl still hadn't seen them as they pressed up behind her. They had been anticipating catching her ever since she went to ground somewhere last week. Now that she had surfaced, their excitement had turned to fear. Leah used the power in the gears and brought herself up level to Dan. She had the vehicle with the heavy winch bumpers, not to mention a lot less chrome than his Discovery had. She keyed the radio. "I'll take lead and give them a nudge," she said. It occurred to Dan that she wasn't asking, she was telling. Again, it was the best idea, as she had the vehicle which would end their pursuit of the girl instantly. He thought back to the only basis she had for this kind of thing that wasn't on television. A demonstration using kids' toy cars on how to make contact to stop another vehicle. It was so ridiculous that she had taken such idly given information and turned it into real-world tactics. "Do it," he said back to her. She looked over at him and nodded before gripping the wheel tighter and pushing ahead. Dan dropped back a couple of car lengths behind her right quarter. They gained on the car quickly. As Leah got to within 10 meters, the passenger window opened, and a man leaned his head and shoulder out with a gun in his hand. Definitely hostile. Leah stood hard on the accelerator and swiped her wheel to the right, hitting the smaller car in the rear doors and pushing it at an angle. She lifted off to give herself space, and saw the passenger aim directly at her as their car lost control and spun. She floored the throttle, hitting the car side on and bouncing it away from her. She lifted off again before stamping down and ducking low to avoid the shot. She hit the car again and peeled off to the left as she flinched away. She heard a metallic clang as a single round ricocheted off the roof. She glanced to her right and saw the car skidding sideways, then spin so violently back towards her that she didn't believe they could survive the crash. The uncontrolled back end of their car had hit a stationary vehicle which was crashed nose first into the central barrier. It spun out 3 times before coming to a mangled stop. Dan timed it perfectly. He saw Leah hit the car and destabilize it, then hit it again to turn it sideways. He saw her final shunt, and then she peeled away, leaving the uncontrollable car to smash into the back of an abandoned Vauxhall. The car spun back around the other way just as he timed it right to squeeze his big vehicle through the gap it left as it went. Marie screamed, and Dan tried to pretend he wasn't holding his breath. Leah had come to a stop and was starting to reverse. She changed the plan again. "I'll cover them. You bring the civvy back and help clear it," she said, breathless with adrenaline or fear or both. "Hurry up," she added. "Will do," Dan answered, and he accelerated hard to hunt down the quarter-mile distance between them and the little car. Emma first realized she wasn't alone when a sound behind her made her glance in the mirror. She saw a car spinning after a big crash, and through the flying debris came a big black vehicle. It got bigger in her mirror. She panicked. Her breathing was rapid and threatened to become uncontrollable. The car wouldn't go any faster. She tried, and it just made more noise, but the speedo wouldn't go over 68 miles an hour. She should have tried to find a better car. It gained on her fast, and she knew she wouldn't get away. With one hand, she tried to get the laptop from her bag to hide it, but lost speed by doing so. The big car surged past her, pulled in front, and slowed. She tried to get past, but lacked the acceleration. It was hopeless. She slowed down to stop, and her mind raced with what these people would do to her. The words of the senior analyst came back to her. "You're like a hamster on a wheel. We should use you as a test subject." She stopped and tried to prepare herself for the worst, searching the bag desperately for the gun. Leah climbed over the passenger seat and out of the vehicle to give herself cover. She took the gun with the scope and lay flat on the ground, watching the wrecked car. Both men were still in their seats, motionless. She forced her breathing to slow down and watched both carefully at 6 times magnification, watching for signs of life and waiting for help to come back. Dan told both of his passengers to stay down, and then got out and held both hands up in front of him. He kept them away from his weapons and approached slowly. He saw the young woman frantically moving before coming up with a gun pointed at him held in both hands. He was about to dive back to the cover of the vehicle, but couldn't risk her firing and hitting Marie or Ash. Leah lay flat and watched the 2 men. The passenger stirred, shaking the shoulder of the driver. She kept the sight over the man's head, hoping she could keep one of them alive to answer questions. Emma panicked. She held the gun shaking in both hands and pointed it at the man who emerged from the big car. He was dressed like a soldier, and he walked slowly with his hands up. She didn't know what to do, but she was sure that she couldn't get away. Dan kept his hands clear of the weapons, not wanting to scare the girl further. She already looked terrified. "We've stopped the men chasing you," he said. She was confused. She thought he was chasing her. Her mouth opened and closed, but the courage to ask anything deserted her. "Please put that down. We're not going to hurt you. There's a young girl back there who needs my help, and the longer you fuck about, the more danger she's in," he snapped. She wanted to trust him. She thought he seemed more annoyed than threatening. Marie quickly grew bored of the lack of reassurance coming from her emotionally constipated partner. She carefully put the gun down on the seat and got out, walking towards the car, showing her empty hands. The girl's gun switched wildly between the 2 targets. Dan considered rushing forward and breaking the window, but now couldn't risk Marie getting hurt. "Please," Marie called out. "We can help you." Dan took another step forward as the girl's grip on the gun faltered, just as he heard 2 gunshots pierce the air. Leah watched him try to wake the driver, then give up and force the mangled door open. It was twisted and bent where she had rammed into the passenger side, and he had to kick out to give himself space to escape. He fell to the floor on all fours and looked around, his eyes resting on her Land Rover. He had a big, heavy-looking automatic handgun in his right hand and was dressed all in black, similar to herself. He raised himself up, dazed by the impact, and pointed the gun at her. She fired, hitting him in the lower leg, an easy shot through her scope. He spun to the floor, pulling the trigger and sending a harmless bullet into the air as he fell. She stayed in position, silently willing her hero and mentor to come back. The scream seemed to take an age to escape the man's mouth, the shock of the pain making it build until it finally escaped and tore the air. Dan couldn't see Leah or the car from where he was, and he shot a pleading look at Marie. "Go," she said to him. He had to trust that the girl was not a threat, just scared. He threw himself behind the wheel and turned around to launch the big 4x4 towards Leah. The seconds it took to cover the ground felt like minutes, and he pulled up short to get out. He left Ash in the car with the door open, telling him to stay. Taking cover behind a vehicle and raising his carbine, he called out to his protégé. "Leah," he called. "Here," came the instant reply, easily heard over 20 meters. "Driver's out of it. Passenger armed with one in the leg. Covering," she called back, not taking her eye off the bleeding, writhing man. Dan moved up along the central reservation, keeping the car visible over his weapon and seeking cover from the side where the passenger was. At 5 meters, he slowed, sidestepping to his right to get a view of the injured man. Dan stepped in quickly, kicking the gun away from him. "Move up," Dan called to Leah. Leah abandoned the G-36 where it was, drawing the Glock from the holster on her chest with a well-practiced hand. She rounded the front of her vehicle and took a line of cover to stand behind Dan, all the while keeping the immobile driver in her sights. The hours of practice showed as they performed their contact drills in silence. She tapped Dan on the back and he slung his carbine to grab the man she had wounded. Dan dragged him up and held him against the side of the car, looking for more weapons and spare ammunition for the gun. The bleeding man said nothing and kept his eyes screwed shut. Dan put him back on the ground and moved to the driver's side. Leah automatically switched her aim to cover the man Dan had searched. Dan drew the Walther and went to open the driver's door, finding it similarly wedged from the impact. He took his finger off the trigger and smashed the window using the butt of the gun. The driver didn't move as the beads of broken glass cascaded over him. Little wonder, Dan thought as he saw the huge injury to the right side of the driver's head. The skull was crushed on one side just above his ear from the impact, and it leaked blood slowly. Dan nodded to Leah and went to the injured man. He was groggy from the crash, and the bullet that passed through his calf had taken enough blood from him to make his face pale. "Who are you? Why were you after the girl?" Dan asked. He received no reply other than the man opening his eyes and staring straight through him. "Who are you?" he asked again, more forcefully. He smiled, dribbling blood from his mouth, and said in a heavily accented voice, "Fuck you," before his eyes closed and his head sagged. Dan checked for a pulse, finding him alive for now. He left him where he was. "Good work, kid. Really good," he said to Leah, prompting a smile of pride. A noise made him look up, and he saw the little car heading back to them. Marie drove, and the girl sat in the passenger seat hugging her bag with eyes wide as she saw the mess in front of her, still gripping the gun tightly. They stopped, and the girl stared at the carnage in front of her. She glanced at Leah and visibly did a double-take at the child. "These men were chasing you," said Dan. "Any idea why?" She shook her head slowly, unable to tear her gaze away from the pool of blood on the ground. "Dan, this is Emma," Marie said. On hearing her name, Emma snapped out of her trance and looked at him. "And this is Leah," Marie finished. Leah kept her gaze over the sights of her gun, still trained on the unconscious man, but said, "Sup," trying to sound cool and succeeding. Emma didn't recognize the men, nor did she know why they were coming after her. "We'll take him back for questioning. Marie, can you drive mine with Emma?" Dan said. Marie nodded, but the girl woke up from her daze again. "No, I've got to keep going," she said, almost believing it herself. "Fine, but rest with us and go on after with supplies and a better car," Dan said. Emma didn't think she had much of a choice, and in the back of her mind she longed for a conversation with anyone but herself. Marie sealed the deal. "Hot showers," she said, leaving the rest to Emma's imagination. Emma shuffled off to the big car and let out a small scream as she saw a huge dog in the window displaying rows of big, sharp teeth. Marie gently reached out and took the gun from Emma's unresisting hands. "Ash, heel," Dan said with a smile, and Ash slunk out of the open door to stand by his feet. "Watch him," he said quietly, pointing at the unconscious man. Ash turned a snarl on him, adding a snap of his teeth, but getting no response. Dan turned to the adult women and nodded. "Leah can take me back with him." They went, and Dan dragged the man to the boot of Leah's car, Ash following ready to attack if given permission or if he moved. Dan sat in the back, keeping a careful eye and a gun on their prisoner as Leah drove. He had a worry that this man was more than averagely dangerous. First Ranger's question time. He told Leah to drive to the farm, a sadistic but effective idea forming in his head. They pulled in and she went to search for Chris. Dan told him what he wanted, adding, "You've read Silence of the Lambs?" Chris had, and he looked puzzled, even a little disturbed, but knew well enough not to ask now. Dan stripped the man and tied his black shirt tight around the ragged bullet hole in his leg. That got a pain response. The naked man was tipped into a wheelbarrow and taken to a small shed where a litter of last year's pigs ran. He tied him up and waited. He got bored of waiting and threw a bucket of dirty water in the man's face, forcing him back into consciousness. Dan kicked him lightly in his wounded leg and stood back as the cry of pain became a murderous look aimed directly through him. Definitely more than averagely dangerous. "Why were you chasing that girl?" Dan asked. "Go fuck your mother," the man said helpfully. "I don't have the time right now. I'm too busy about to fuck you instead," Dan retorted in an annoyingly calm manner. The man responded with a fairly legible rant about England, Dan, and his mother again, along with other various subjects which rapidly bored him. He even threatened Dan with what would happen when he got out of his current predicament, before he lapsed back into his native language to better continue the obscenities. Dan sighed, explaining that he obviously wasn't going to untie him just so he could try and escape, and have to have his arse handed to him a second time today. "Only this time it won't be done by a 13-year-old girl," he said with a smile, and stepped close. "I do hope you can understand me properly," he said as he leaned in closer to him. "I'm going to really, really hurt you unless you tell me what I want to know. If you do, you might get a doctor. If you don't, I'll keep going until you die. Up to you." The man probably understood him because he spat at Dan's face. That was a mistake. Dan could handle being punched, shot at, stabbed, but he really disliked spitters. He hit him in the body with 4 hard punches in quick succession, alternating hands as he did. He stepped back, waiting for the man to catch his breath and abuse him again. He suddenly remembered that Leah was still there watching and thought to send her away. He didn't. It wasn't like he could remove any more of her childhood, as there was probably nothing left. The only reason he had someone to interrogate was because she'd had the foresight to intentionally wound him. If she had wanted to from that distance, she could have put bullets through both eyes. The head rose again, and Dan didn't wait for the next volley of obscene abuse. He stepped in and delivered another series of stinging blows. The man hung limply again, catching his breath. Twice more Dan did that, trying to establish a pattern in the man's head that this wouldn't stop no matter what he said. That way he wouldn't bother keeping anything back. That was the theory anyway. Dan decided on a different approach as his impatience got the better of him, selecting a pronged fork for moving straw, which he used to poke at the bullet wound, drawing screams of agony. "You're going to die of infection, and these pigs are going to eat you," Dan said nastily. "No more, please," the man said. Dan asked him again. He gave his answers in gasps, his breath ragged from the beatings, finally giving up their intentions when Leah ended their pursuit. "We follow her, waiting for her to hit roadblock." "What else?" he asked, raising the pitchfork again. "No, I tell you everything," he screamed. Dan doubted that, but he'd at least removed his suspicions that the girl was different to any other vulnerable survivor. Still, there was just something not right about her. She seemed too new. The scientist. The prisoner was shut in a room on the farm. Chris watched the door until Dan got back to the house and sent Joe up to take over. Dan would have to deal with him soon, but not before he had found out more. He wanted to ask the new girl her story before his suspicion got the better of him. He walked into the house with Leah and Ash. He left Leah in ops cleaning her carbine and full of pride, giving Ash a bowl of food and telling him to stay with her. She did well today, he thought. He walked into the dining room looking for the new arrival. instead finding Marie with a hot drink. "Where is she?" he barked. Marie was not amused with his tone, and her face let him know that. "Hello. Where's the new girl?" he said patiently, with a smile and a tone of voice which showed far more deference. Marie thought that was better. "She's showering. She hasn't had hot water in weeks." "What did she tell you?" Dan asked, trying to get as much background as he could until he could speak to her.
"She was in a facility down south somewhere, underground. Some kind of shelter, I presume. The power ran out, and they went outside. She's heading for Scotland. That's all she said," Marie told him.
"Something's not right," he said, sitting down opposite her. "Up for a little tag team interview with her?" Emma stood under the hot water, letting it soak through her greasy hair and wash the film of dried sweat from her skin. She scrubbed herself clean twice over, letting the fear of the previous weeks rinse down the plug with the soapy water. She shaved and washed until she started to feel human again. She dried herself with a clean towel and dressed in the clean clothes they had given her. She picked up her bag before walking out of the bathroom, making her way back downstairs. Kara had laid out a selection of food, making her forget her normal hang-ups about people seeing her eat. She ate hungrily, savoring real food again. When she had finished, the man she had pointed a gun at earlier stood and offered her some coffee. It tasted good.
"So, Emma," said the blonde woman, Marie, smiling, "tell us about yourself."
She paused, wondering why she felt the need to be secretive about her plans. "It's okay," said the man. "We've all of us got a past. But something tells me yours is a little different."
What did he know?
She glanced at her bag, then back to them. Dan resisted the urge to reach over and snatch the rucksack away and find out for himself.
"I need a plug point," Emma said quietly, "to be able to show you properly."
The three of them went to Ops, where the laptop was plugged in, and started its slow warm-up. She took her voice recorder and connected it to the USB port.
"I was involved in a virology research program as part of my doctorate," she said. "When word first reached us that an epidemic was spreading, they moved all of our research and most of the team into a facility in the city. There were others, politicians and military."
Her eyes glazed over. Marie prompted her to continue.
"Most people sent to our site didn't get in. It was only really the first ones who weren't infected. We locked down and watched the world fall apart from the CCTV monitors, but we lost power in the end."
She spoke softly, slowly, like it was all becoming real to her just now.
"Eventually the solar power and the generator fuel ran out, and we had to leave. It was never designed to hold out indefinitely without being able to go topside. We left, and everyone got sick and died. Except me."
She decided not to mention the Colonel and his breakdown. She didn't want to have to justify out loud leaving a human being to die. "What's in Scotland?" asked Dan.
"The main virology research center. It's a top secret thing. Even my team didn't know about it until we spoke to them in the bunker. We lost contact with them too," she said sadly, suddenly feeling very tired. "I was hoping I could get there and find out what this is. I have a theory, but you might not like it," she finished as she typed in a long password to log on to the computer. "Go on," Marie urged her gently. "This pathogen is very fast-acting. The gestation period to fatality is the quickest of all known lethal infections ever. It's like Spanish flu on steroids,"
she explained as she turned the computer to show colored graphs depicting something which Dan lacked the patience to comprehend. Get to the point, he thought irritably. "So?" he asked when no further explanation came.
"So I think it is Spanish flu on steroids, don't you see?"
She brought up another chart showing times between exposure, symptoms becoming visible, and death.
"Nothing natural should be this lethal so quickly. But there must be a random element of natural immunity. How are we all still alive? I see no obvious genetic theme running in all of the survivors, so why didn't we die?
Dan hoped the questions were rhetorical, as she was starting to lose him a little. So what are you saying? He asked, in simple terms.
I'm saying we were attacked. I believe this to be an airborne biological weapon. Possibly, she said with resounding finality.
Dan's mind swam with ideas and theories as he walked back to the farm. Joe had taken over watching the unconscious attacker. Dan had talked with Marie about what to do with him, not necessarily open to ideas other than putting him down. It was Leah who pointed out that he had been bound, blindfolded, and mostly unconscious when they brought him back, and that he had only seen the inside of a shed while there. Dan agreed that he didn't need to die, but dumping him somewhere with a bullet hole in his leg would be worse than killing the man himself. He cleaned and dressed the wound, giving the man back his clothes and adding a bottle of antibiotic tablets. His hands were tied behind his back, and he was blindfolded again before being put in the boot of Dan's Discovery, then driven around for over 20 miles of aimless driving just to confuse him, before he was taken back to where his dead friend sat in the wrecked car. He was handed the keys to the small vehicle Emma had been driving, and told very firmly that if he was ever seen by them again, they would kill him. The man drove south without looking back. Science trip. Emma agreed to stay for a while and recover her strength, as her recent illness had left her weak. Marie called a council meeting that night and explained what had happened with Emma and what she had said afterwards. The news of an attack using biological weapons being a possibility didn't really affect any of them, which frustrated Dan. "If this is a bioweapon, don't you see the implications?" he asked, the blank faces staring at him. "If we've been attacked by another country, ask yourselves why." Nobody spoke. "What if it's a precursor to invasion?" he suggested to them, finally getting some hint in their faces that they were beginning to grasp the point. "We have no idea if any other countries are affected by it. It could simply be that the island has been quarantined."
"Slight problem with that theory," offered Neil. "If there were still other people, other intact governments out there in the world, then why haven't we seen any aircraft?"
Dan thought about that one. He hadn't seen anything in the sky that hadn't evolved to fly in almost a year, not even a faint vapor trail. He assumed that if they were under quarantine, there would at least be some kind of reconnaissance flight higher up, or even a broadcast on the radio. "Granted," Dan said. "So the other possibilities are that we've been attacked and are going to see Chinese tanks or whoever heading down the driveway soon, or that the whole world is affected."
"It doesn't really matter what we think, though, does it?" said Chris quietly. "How are we going to know for sure?"
Dan took a breath and told them of the conversation he and Marie had had with their newest guest. "Emma wants to go to some lab in Scotland where they test stuff like this. She said she might be able to say whether the virus is synthetic or not."
There was silence in the room as each considered the benefits.
"But what would the point be?" asked Chris again. "How will it affect us?" "Honestly, I don't know, but it may give us some answers. I think there's no harm in helping her," Dan said, waiting for the next question.
"Help her how?" said Marie.
"She'll need a vehicle and supplies. I also think she should have an escort." He left it there.
"Who?"
said Marie, worrying what the answer would be. "I don't know yet," said Dan carefully. "It would have to be a ranger, obviously, and it would be their choice to go."
This meant that it would probably be him. "Shall we bring the other rangers in?" Marie inquired.
"Please let me speak to them first," Dan replied. "Shall we meet tomorrow?" He sat at the table in ops, having asked Leah to shut the door. The door hadn't been shut since the day they found the house. Dan finished the explanation and let the silence hang heavy. The same questions were floated around the table, and they weighed the benefits and risks of the journey.
"It's not like a cure is an issue. There's very few of us left," said Steve.
knowing if it was deliberate or nature redressing some kind of imbalance is academic, surely. Lexi agreed. Better to forget the past and concentrate on the future, she felt. Still, something in the back of Dan's mind wanted to know more about what had happened to them. Are none of you interested to know if it's the same everywhere? What if we're the only ones affected? He asked them. He sensed something from them, more nervous than apathetic. She wants to go, and I won't stop her, Dan said. But she has a better chance of surviving the trip and bringing back answers if she has an escort. She didn't even know she was being chased when we found her, for God's sake.
I'd go, but you probably won't let me, Leah offered.
Correct, said Steve. You're not going. I will. He looked directly at Dan and repeated himself. I'll go. Okay, Dan said, seeing the relief on the faces of Lexi and Joe.
Get me the location, said Leah. I'll start looking at a route.
They went to find Emma to tell her what they had decided. She accepted the news quietly, shaking Steve's hand as they were formally introduced. I want to give you the best chance of making it there, so that's why Steve is going to take you, said Dan. Also, I'd like you to do some training with us so that you know what to do in different situations. Chances are the journey north will be dangerous. Without us, it's highly unlikely you'll make it there. Sorry to sound blunt, but it's the truth.
Emma accepted this and asked when they would leave. Steve said it would take a week to prepare properly. Emma closed the laptop and stood, indicating her readiness to start straight away. Steve led Emma off to begin Survival 101 after Dan asked for the location of the facility. He gave this to Leah as he passed, taking Steve's Defender to Neil's workshop on the farm. An oil-stained Neil looked up from where he was buried in the engine of a tractor with the diminutive Ewan assisting in replacing whatever part had failed. They greeted Dan warmly, giving the sense of being men happy in their work. Dan told him what he wanted, making Neil's brain spin with the possibilities and problems. Extra fuel tank up top, he suggested, pointing to the roof rack. I'll have to strip the rear seats to make space for spare wheels and tools, but they'll still have to travel fairly light.
Not a problem, said Dan. How long do you reckon?
Neil thought for a while and said 5 days. Dan knew he meant 3. He just wanted to look good getting it done ahead of time. He thanked him and walked back to the house with Ash.
The mission. Steve had been thorough with Emma's training. She was well equipped, and he had given her basic weapon training with a pistol for worst-case self-defense situations. She packed and repacked her equipment until he was happy that she could save no more weight. Neil had done well. Steve's Defender had been thoroughly serviced and checked before the retrofitting had begun, and now it had a large, heavy plastic reservoir tank on the roof rack. Neil's estimate that it held enough fuel for another 500 miles was probably generous, but he had included a hand pump to fill the 2 charged jerry cans fitted inside the rear door. The roof tank had a large opening on top which could be refilled with ease, and he brimmed it with the slightly pink-tinged liquid from the agricultural tank. 4 spare wheels were strapped down behind the rear seats, with almost half of the boot space left for their equipment. He had even patched the bullet score mark above the windscreen. Evidence of Leah's interception marked the front bumper with minor dents and scratches, but having hit the soft skin of a car with a heavy steel bumper left nothing more than cosmetic damage. He brought the heavy off-roader down to the house, sporting its 9 wheels and almost 1,000-mile fuel range. Steve emerged carrying heavy bags. He was armed with his sidearm and M4, and had a vest stocked well with spare magazines. He also took an MK-14 and an additional handgun, which was stashed in the glove compartment. Emma had been equipped with a ballistic vest and sturdy clothing. Both carried minimal personal equipment, with camp cots and sleeping bags to complement their small stove and box of tinned food. They took plenty of water, anticipating a few weeks away at worst. Emma cleared her throat nervously.
"Can I ask for one more favor?" she asked the small assembled group. Dan invited her to proceed. I've collected blood samples from the people I was underground with after they showed signs of infection.
Her voice dropped into uncertainty before she took a breath and raised her head.
To be able to have other samples to test against, I'd like if you would allow me to take samples from some of you, she finished.
Awkward silence hung over the gathering until Dan took the lead and rolled up his left sleeve. "I'll go first," he announced, prompting half a dozen people to follow suit and file into the medical wing. They left after breakfast with no ceremony, everyone acting as though it were a normal trip out to try and convince themselves. Steve drove steadily, weaving the heavy Defender through the overgrown roads. In places, what used to be two wide lanes had become a single tunnel between the hedges grown wild in the spring. Leah had done well with their route. She had marked a series of roads snaking north with alternative loops in places. Their journey was engineered to avoid the major population centers and to keep off the motorways through the most built-up areas. It would not be a quick drive, but it should minimize the risks they had to take. Steve found Emma to be a quiet, nervous girl. In truth, she was no girl, and close to finishing her doctorate, although still half his own age. He didn't mind. He liked silence, and she didn't have much to say for the first day. He didn't feel the need to fill the void with unnecessary talking, and she didn't ask questions. His job was to get them there, and she couldn't help much with that. Her job was at the lab. They moved onwards, Emma lost in her thoughts and theories, and Steve concentrating on the road ahead. Roadblocks. 3 times on the first day they had to double back and take alternative loops. It was easy enough to avoid the blockages, but after the 3rd time, Steve's impatience and tiredness got to him. He had been concentrating all day, and they had barely made more than 100 miles. Emma was some help reading the maps, but she wasn't a navigator by any means. She was more used to negotiating underground train maps than planning a route by car. He had to stop and check it himself a few times, conscious not to let his annoyance show through as he did so. As the sun started to set, Steve called a stop to the day and cleared a small building on a higher patch of ground off the road. Emma had still barely said 2 words since they had left, not that he took offense to her manner. As Steve set up the camping cooker and began to erect his cot, she broke her silence and asked for help. She caught her finger and swore loudly, dropping the half-made bed as she hopped around holding her hand. Steve smiled at her misfortune. "It's not bloody funny," she admonished him. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't laugh." "Here," he replied, helping her put the square poles in the right order. He finished the bed easily, and she sat on the taut canvas heavily, tired from a day sitting in a car concentrating. "I'd never even slept outside of a proper bed until the bunker," she said, head in her hands as she rubbed her face. "Never too old to experience something new," Steve said, instantly regretting sounding so contrite. He busied himself heating the water for a hot drink as she got up and wandered around, looking at the old contents of the shelves in their temporary shelter. "I wondered about this kind of thing for years," she said distantly. Steve had never heard her speak other than to ask or answer direct questions, so his interest was piqued with her sudden daydreaming. "About camping in a derelict shop with an aging helicopter pilot?" he asked, attempting to lighten the mood. "No," she said, running a finger along the packets containing long-ago spoiled food. "About what would happen with a virus or something like this. It was all numbers and theories. Infectivity ratios, urban population versus rural survival rates, developing algorithms to predict the spread." She trailed off as she walked slowly, bringing her back to the cot. "That kind of thing. I never once actually considered what it would have been like to survive day by day without modern comforts." She stopped, fixing her gaze directly on him. "Without fast food and the internet, most people would just fade away," she said with a smile, bringing herself out of her daydream with levity to detract from her darker thoughts. surely would, agreed Steve, decanting hot water into 2 mugs and replacing it on the cooker to add packets of instant noodles. The regular silence lowered its veil over them for the rest of the evening. They ate, they walked away quietly to tend to their own personal needs, and they lay in their cots after darkness, settled with no conversation other than to wish each other a customary good night. The next 4 days went by very similarly. Some days they made more distance, others far less. They found places of interest on the journey north, and Steve took the opportunity to top off his fuel, despite not having had to use the large reserve tank on the roof yet. Emma offered to drive once, and Steve accepted to give his body a rest from the constant position behind the wheel. She crunched the gears, and her clutch control was so ineffective that Steve's back hurt more in the passenger seat. Despite their lack of conversation, he felt comfortable enough in her company to offer his opinion about it. "Do you actually know how to drive?" he asked after they nudged the curb for no reason for the 3rd time.
Yes. I just haven't been behind the wheel much since I learned how, she admitted reluctantly.
He took back the controls as soon as it was polite to do so. He tried to explain that he wasn't being chauvinistic about it, but was more worried for the fuel consumption and the possible damage to the car. The more he explained, the more he felt himself sinking into the hole he was digging. He gave up, and they fell back into their normal, quiet routine. After 6 days, and not a single soul seen, they crossed over the border into Scotland. Royal visit. Pat thought long and hard about how to go about his business. He considered sending some of his boys in to be rescued by them, conjuring up elaborate plans of showing resistance with a gun battle so they were more inclined to trust his moles. He dismissed that. The accuracy and savagery of the shooting aimed at them when just one of them came still echoed in his thoughts. Maybe just a straightforward visit. Stroll up and knock on the front door. A bit of civility cost nothing. His new chief scout had told him about 2 other vehicles like the one which had come to his land. He had to assume that meant another 2 armed similarly and just as dangerous. He didn't have the hardware to counter that. True, he had lots of guns, but they were all hunting tools and not military grade like those he had faced. He didn't want to risk a conflict with this group, as he had no idea how many of them there were, but he couldn't allow their incursion to go unchallenged. Rules must be agreed, and compensation paid. "Load up, boys!" he shouted, sparking a series of flurried movements as the nearest of his subjects scrambled to their feet. "We're going to visit the English." Dan gave up on trying to keep Leah off the front line. She was undoubtedly capable, but he still worried that she was far too young to go out alone. He was teaching her how to use the heavy-caliber battle rifle one morning. Not that she required much instruction after Steve's thorough lessons. She had mastered using the automatic carbine in a day, and followed suit with the suppressor and scope like Dan's. Her M4 was painted in a dappled camouflage color, and she cherished it more than she used to cherish her phone. He realized how quickly he had become accustomed to seeing her armed. Before it happened, the thought of a child carrying guns was abhorrent to him, even more so because of his personal experiences. But seeing her emulate him was flattering, and he felt a genuine pride in her abilities. The scared little girl was long gone. In her place stood a fierce and fit young woman, the next generation of their leadership. Dan had decided that if he was going to have to rely on her to cover him, he preferred it if she was firing either lots more or heavier rounds. They took turns firing 5 rounds each from the battle rifle into a large tree at about 400 meters, and Leah matched his accuracy easily. At half that distance, she joked that she could draw a smiley face. Engine noise pierced the edge of their hearing, rendering both of them quiet, just as Ash sat up from where he lay flat, turning his head towards the source. The noise was wrong. It wasn't the heavy metallic sounds of their own diesels, but the higher-pitched note of a petrol engine. More notes joined the first until it sounded like a small swarm of bees were headed their way. They ran back to the house, and as they neared the drive, Dan handed back the heavy rifle he had carried and silently pointed Leah up to one of the solar panel towers. He stood his ground in the middle of the drive, 50 meters in front of the house, and fired the ugly shotgun twice into the air. Seconds later, Rich ran from the house with a rifle in hand. He dropped to one knee by the tree line to Dan's left and asked what was going on.
Engines, not ours. Sounds like quite a few, and they're coming our way. I need the gardens and the farm on lockdown and everyone armed, Dan said as he scanned the limits of his vision through his scope. Rich ran back to the house without another word, no doubt getting straight on the CB radio. Lexi and Joe were off site, but Joe was still in radio range and turned around to head home in support. Noises of activity started to grow behind Dan, indicating that others were arming themselves and preparing for whatever came their way. Rich sprinted back to him, now wearing a vest filled with spare magazines.
"Jack's on the radio. Where do you want me?" Rich asked.
"Farm. If they come down there, then put an ambush in on the driveway. I've got Leah up top with a heavy rifle," Dan replied, pointing towards Leah's nest.
Rich nodded and ran in a wide loop to the right, making cross-country to the farm as Dan sent Ash into the trees to hide. The noises of engines grew louder until Dan could clearly make out different notes before the sight that unfolded made his mouth drop open. A large black car rolled down the drive, surrounded by 6 motorcycles positioned as outriders. It was an unintentional parody of a traveling dignitary, a farce in the ruins of their old lives. Dan would have laughed had he not been so shocked and on the edge at the intrusion. He made a show of slowly racking the bolt on his weapon before settling into his shoulder and taking a sideways stance. He was conscious not to point the gun at them, but held it ready enough to raise it if needed. He hoped that the message was clear enough. The ridiculous motorcade came to rest 20 meters from him as the driver got out and made a show of looking around before he opened the rear door. Very Secret Service, but he completely failed to notice the young girl pointing a rifle at him, which was capable of tearing through the roof and killing the important passenger without even seeing him. Amateurs, thought Dan. All for show. The passenger got out. Dan was presented with a fat man wearing a suit with the most pretentious thing he had ever seen on his head. The man was wearing a crown. The fake Secret Service agent strode forward, complete with sunglasses, and stood in front of Dan.
"I present the King of Wales. You will address him as Your Majesty," he commanded.
"Will I? Well, you can bugger off and go talk into your sleeve, sunshine," Dan replied. He was not in the mood to be dictated to on his own doorstep. His Majesty King Patrick took the reins. "No need for unpleasantness," boomed the self-made sovereign as he stepped forward and offered Dan a hand. "Patrick," he said, "King of Wales." Dan ignored the hand and tightened the grip on his carbine.
"What's your business here, Fagin?"
Dan said. He dropped his hand and boomed a laugh.
"Do I need a reason to visit a neighboring country and offer the hand of friendship?"
"Let me tell you what I know," Dan said carefully. "A while ago, one of my lot fired on your ambush and rescued 4 women who didn't want to be part of your happy gang. With that in mind, you can see why I'm a little skeptical about you being here." King Patrick's face dropped, all semblance of joviality abandoned.
"You forgot that one of yours killed one of mine in cold blood," he said acidly.
"Regrettable but unavoidable," replied Dan equably. "If you don't want more bloodshed, I suggest you turn around and fuck off over the border, pal." Pat sneered.
"What's to stop me cutting you down? Right here," he said nastily as he opened his suit jacket and exposed a gun in his waistband.
Dan slowly took his hands away from his weapon, drew himself up to his full height, and smiled. "Nothing," he said. "Only that you wouldn't live long enough to drag that toy past your gut. Heel!" He snapped to his left without taking his eyes from the man. Ash prowled forwards, head low, and teeth exposed in a silent snarl. To make his point more firmly, Dan glanced very deliberately up to his right and back to the intruder. Pat tore his eyes away from the savage animal watching him and glanced in the direction of the scaffolding tower. From a distance of less than 30 meters, the sound of a heavy bullet slowly being racked into a chamber was unmistakable.
"And we're just the ones you can see," Dan said. "If you tried anything now and by some miracle survived, then the way out is far more dangerous than you can imagine. So leave now, and forget any ideas you have about taking us on."
Pat was many things, but he was not stupid. He relaxed and brought back the genial smile from before as he waved to his group to relax. "How about we just talk then?" he said.
"Your lot stay here. No weapons inside,"
Dan said. Pat removed his handgun, as did his bodyguard.
"If they move from the car, they will be shot. Please make that clear to them,"
he finished. He looked to Leah, who raised a thumb to tell him that she had overheard and understood. Dan walked to the house, and at the front door he turned to face his two uninvited guests.
"Hold your arms out,"
he instructed them. Pat smiled and complied as Dan ran deft hands over him, checking for weapons. The bodyguard wasn't happy and started to protest being searched.
"Fine," snapped Dan. "Stay out here with him."
He pointed to Ash as he muttered, "Watch him." The dog's sudden snarling was encouragement enough for the man to hold his arms out and stand very still. Dan took a knife from the man's waistband and dropped it on the floor outside. "What about your weapons?" the bodyguard summoned up the courage to ask. Dan turned to him.
"My roof, my rules,"
he said with finality before leading them inside. People were moving around, some carrying shotguns. Dan walked into the lounge area and nodded to Marie to stay before loudly asking to have the room. Foreign Relations. The four sat in silence for a while until His Majesty King Patrick asked an audacious question. "No coffee?" he said with a smile.
"He won't be staying long enough,"
replied Dan.
"State your business."
Patrick sighed, annoyed at missing the opportunity to observe the proprieties. "Seems to me that we need to discuss borders, among other things," he began. "Simple," said Marie, rapidly picking up on exactly who this man wearing a ridiculous gold circlet was. "We don't cross into Wales and you don't cross into England." Patrick shook his head. "It's not quite that simple, my love," he began. Marie's anger flashed, putting the fat pretender firmly in his place. "Do not walk into my house and patronize me," she snapped savagely as she stood to tower over him. "I see a very clear solution. You call yourself the King of Wales, so you have Wales and we won't encroach. You are not in any position to dictate terms otherwise. I will happily provide details of the fates of people who have threatened us here if you would like." Her outburst silenced the man. His bodyguard looked nervous. He doubted he had any chance of competing with the man sitting opposite him, even if he was unarmed, and the huge dog watching his every move unsettled him greatly. Outgunned and outclassed, he felt it best to keep silent. Patrick seemed to realize that he shouldn't push the issue. "I meant no offense, my lord." He stopped himself before he invited another tirade from the steely woman. "Madam, I merely wish to establish firm rules to prevent further clashes between our nations." "Agreed. You stay in your country and we shall stay in ours. I can't see any way we would clash as long as that is observed," she said more calmly. "Now, tell us how you knew where to find our home." Patrick sat back and grinned with smug satisfaction. "My eyes and ears have a long reach," he bragged magnanimously.
"So one of your feral children followed my ranger back undetected," said Dan. "We're more than capable of returning the favor. We paid a visit to a group we didn't like recently. I'd say you could ask them how it went, but you'd need a seance." He left it there, the threat hanging heavily.
"Fine," said Patrick. "We keep to our own and you do the same. But that doesn't mean we have to be enemies."
"What are you proposing?" Marie asked.
"We aren't animals, despite what the woman you brought back told you. We need more women to have babies, and we've suffered miscarriages and a stillbirth since this all started. We're not unlike yourselves, honestly," he said, unconvincingly. Dan reckoned that they probably were just how he thought. He wanted breeders.
"If you suggest for 1 second that we give you women, you're out of your bloody mind. We don't run a dictatorship here. We look after our people and don't force them to do things they don't want to. We still have our humanity."
Marie stood. "Thank you for the visit, but we will not trade with your group, nor will you take anyone from us. Goodbye," she said with finality. "There's still the matter of compensation to be discussed," Patrick announced in a commanding tone. "The death of one of my boys, and the destruction of 3 cars."
"Compensation?"
asked Dan incredulously. Patrick nodded, wobbling his jowls and the ludicrous crown as his head moved.
"No, there will be no compensation. You can go now, but you would better not consider coming back."
Pat wasn't so easily dissuaded. "All I ask is for some weapons to defend ourselves," he blurted out, all confidence gone. "To bully and steal, you mean?" Marie hit back.
"I have a rule. I never put a gun in the hands of anyone I don't trust. I don't trust you,"
Dan said simply. "You can leave now," said Marie, turning her back and walking out. Dan smiled and gestured with his arm the way to the front door. A deflated king and his useless bodyguard shuffled out, marked every step by Ash and followed by Dan. The bodyguard nervously stopped to retrieve his knife, still watched by the dog. Dan considered telling Ash to leave him, but decided to let the dog enjoy himself. Ash was a killer, but he also enjoyed his amateur dramatics. Dan followed them to the car, and as Patrick was walking to the rear door, he spoke softly to him.
"Tell them whatever you like to save face, but seriously, don't come back. We have over 70 people, and I can arm more than half of them. Don't think you can take us on, because you can't. We want to be left alone, and trust me, you don't want us to have to come calling."
Patrick looked at him and nodded once. He sat down heavily in the back of the car and breathed out a long sigh of defeat. He had come expecting his royal status to carry weight, only to find a larger group of people who were far better equipped and organized than his own. He had showed his hand and found himself facing better cards. Luckily, he had gambled nothing on this round, and doubted he could afford to sit down at the green cloth again. "Hold your fire." Steve threw himself behind the engine block of an abandoned car and screamed at Emma to get down. Rounds pinged and whined off the metal as 3 or 4 people shot at his hiding place. "Stop shooting!" he bellowed. 3 times he repeated this, until he heard shouts and voices coming from the blocked road ahead. He had got out to see if he could force a way through or drag clear an obstruction using the winches on his Land Rover, but the way was thoroughly blocked. Almost deliberately so, he thought, just as the first shot tore the air. It probably wasn't intended to hit him, but that made little difference when being fired at. Emma had ducked down in the footwell of the truck, despite Steve's instructions to never hide in a vehicle if someone shoots at you. They ignored her, concentrating their fire on his position until they finally relented. "What do you want?" came the faint shout in an unmistakably Scottish accent. "We just want to get past. We'll go another way. Just please don't bloody shoot," he responded, blood pumping hard around his body. "Put down your guns," came the instruction. Steve was annoyed. He had brought enough weaponry to cope with losing his personal weapons, but it was a matter of principle not to allow himself to be robbed.
We mean you no harm. We are literally passing through. We don't want any trouble, he shouted back from his hiding place. Hands in the air, and come out now, shouted a new voice, this one closer and full of authority. Steve held both hands up and slowly rose with the carbine dangling on its sling. He saw a big man in green camouflage pointing a military rifle at him. Everything about him, his clothes, his stance, his voice, made Steve think he was a trained soldier. He tried a new approach. I'm Flight Lieutenant Stephen Bennett of the Royal Air Force, he declared, standing tall and investing his words with an entitlement which bordered on arrogance. The man responded, only a slight flinch as he fought down the urge of ingrained obedience to senior officers. Enlisted man, Steve thought. What's your purpose here, sir? The man asked in a quieter voice. Like I said, we're passing through, he replied. We're from a group a week's journey to the south. I'm taking someone to the highlands. Still the man hesitated, keeping his weapon trained on Steve's chest. Look, we're friendly. We just want to be on our way, he tried again. Sorry, sir. Can't let you do that, replied the soldier stiffly. On whose orders? Steve invested the question with all the commissioned officer-like tone he could muster, seeing the man struggle with his sense of duty. Sir, he barked, with respect, I'd ask you to remove your weapons and come with us voluntarily. Steve sighed and slowly reached down to unclip the carbine. The soldier indicated for him to put it on the bonnet and add his sidearm and knife next to it. Please call your friend out, sir, he instructed politely. Tell them to keep their hands up and move slow. Steve called out to Emma, repeating the instructions. She came out and stood by his side. The soldier lowered his rifle a little, but kept it at the ready. He assured them that they would be treated well, as long as they showed no hostility, stuttering over his words, as he seemed a little transfixed with the attractive young woman who had emerged, scared, from the Land Rover. They were searched and allowed to lower their hands before they walked with the soldier and two others through a gap in the deliberately piled-up vehicle barricade. They walked for about a mile before emerging through a tree line to see rows of large green tents lined up neatly against the wall of a big distribution warehouse. Activity flurried everywhere, and Steve lost count of the people, but guessed he had seen almost 100 of them. Neither tried to engage the soldier in conversation, Emma preferring silence anyway, and Steve electing to save his breath for the organ grinder. They were walked into the huge hangar, and into an outer office, which previously would have belonged to the manager of this place. It now belonged to the commander of this group, with a heavy military theme running throughout. They sat and waited, even being offered coffee, until the door to the inner office opened and a clean-shaven young man smiled at them. He looked to be about mid-20s, fit, and wearing a 3-starred epaulet on the chest of his uniform. Captain Richards, he said in his soft Scottish accent, shaking their hands. Formerly of the 51st Infantry, but now it seems I am officer commanding the 1st Battalion of Survivors. He smiled at his own joke, clearly having made it before on numerous occasions. Flight Lieutenant Steve Bennett, RAF, he replied, adding, retired, before he could be pressed instantly into active service by this enthusiastic young man. The young officer's face lit up to find a fellow officer's mess buddy. Emma, she said quietly, taking the offered hand shyly. What were you flying? He asked Steve, inviting them both to sit opposite his large desk covered in papers. Merlins mostly. Sea Kings to oil rigs most recently. Wonderful stuff, replied Captain Richards, brain working overtime behind his smiling eyes. What brings you to our camp? He asked. Your soldier frog marched us here at gunpoint, Emma said, quiet but indignant. I can only apologize for that. I am truly sorry for the manner in which you were detained, he said, full of sincerity. As you can imagine, there are some who don't play nicely with others. He shrugged, offering no further explanation. We've met our fair share, said Steve. Tell us about what you have here, please. Richards looked delighted, the perpetual mask of politeness and contentment on his face staying firmly in place.
We have almost 150 survivors on the strength. We've established medical services and have sufficient stores stockpiled to sustain us for quite some time. We are looking to move in the future to an area we can easily occupy and grow supplies, he said, giving very little away. What about yourselves?
Over 100 of us. A week's journey south. Medical services and farms established. Well armed and entrenched, as we've suffered some attacks, Steve said, embellishing the figure slightly, as he wasn't sure about their host just yet.
Excellent, Richard said as something flashed in his eyes. Would you consider joining us? He asked, taking them by surprise.
Steve answered carefully, not wanting to offend the brash man 20 years his junior. We are well established and settled, but thanks. We put a lot of effort into adapting our home, and I doubt anyone would want to leave.
Richards nodded but said nothing. Steve was starting to trust him less. We seem to be in luck, Richard said, changing the subject with startling suddenness. We have a helicopter not far from here, and now we have someone to fly it. Steve was taken aback by the change of topic, and by reflex asked what it was. Chinook, declared Richards with glee. Bloody massive beast it is. Steve told him regrettably that he had never flown one.
They're not the easiest things to control. You'd need another pilot and crew to get one of those in the air.
What about maintenance? He asked, knowing that without significant skilled work, there was no way even a small craft would ever fly. I'm sure there are some manuals lying around, Richard said, with arrogant dismissal of the problems facing his plans to get a helicopter in the air.
It's not that easy, really, Steve started, but was cut short with an irritated wave of Richards' hand.
We'll discuss that later. Tell me why you're here, he ordered with a false smile. Steve was wary. He didn't exactly trust what he was seeing here. It was too military, and Richards was deploying far too much effort in looking happy with life. He thought quickly, but was unable to come up with a reason for their trip that didn't involve the whole truth. He looked at Emma, who met his gaze and shrugged.
Emma is a scientist, and she wants to find a lab she knows to run some tests, he said simply.
Richards raised his eyebrows, but his smile stayed fixed in place. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his legs as he fiddled with a pen in his hand. Tests, he said lightly. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Yes, I want to check if whatever it was will mutate. There's a very small percentage of natural immunity, and a mutation could wipe us all out permanently. I need the lab because I know it's got the equipment I need to run the tests. Steve tried to keep his face neutral as she smoothly lied next to him. He wanted to conjure up a story like that, as he didn't want to inflame the situation by mentioning biological warfare. Emma was providing exactly that, and it was coming out seamlessly. No doubt there was a lot of truth in the things she was saying, because it all sounded so realistic. But it was all news to Richards. Richards listened intently, never once letting his mask slip as Emma made her explanations. When she finished, Steve chimed in. So we're hoping to get on our way as soon as possible. Richards thought for a second and then sat forward with sudden movement. He stood, dropped the pen on his desk, and invited them to tour his command with him. The invitation was less of a suggestion and more of an instruction, but Steve played along with the pretense of them being guests. They were led among the rows of tents, all neatly lined up in uniform rows. Richard struck Steve as a man who liked straight lines and obedience. Winter was hard on us, he explained as he paced in front of them. Had to move everyone inside the hangar. It was a very unproductive time. He invested the word unproductive with scorn, as if the insult was a serious one. Operations have gone well, though, on the whole. We're close to the point where we can send an advance party ahead to scout where we want to relocate. He stopped and turned to face Steve. I'll not mess you around, he said intensely. I want you to join us. You'll be given appropriate rank and have the pick of anyone you need to get me a bird in the air. Steve was so dumbfounded by the suddenness and directness of the man. He was also silent, because he realized his first instinct wasn't to decline. Richards turned to Emma before Steve could say a word. "And yourself, too. We have a medical team, and your expertise will be valuable," he said. Steve didn't know how to respond. Before he had a chance, Richards let him off the hook. "You can go and do your thing first, obviously. I'd be pleased if you'd stay with us tonight, and I'll provide an escort for you in the morning." He turned and walked on, giving no indication as to whether they should follow. They did, and Steve caught Emma looking at him with clear concern showing in her eyes. He thought the invitations and the offers of shelters and an escort weren't negotiable. They were driven back to their Land Rover and followed their guide back to the camp via a smaller road. Steve locked everything but his sidearm away, hidden in the vehicle, and was conscious to keep the weapon tucked under his clothes. They settled in for an awkward night. The bodyguard. Their evening wasn't unpleasant. The people all went about their business in a subdued manner, and Steve was reminded of the times he had spent aboard large Navy ships. They were allowed to mix freely with the 100 or so people they could see in camp, and Emma found a fellow medical science type. They talked for a couple of hours about their theories and findings before Emma asked outright about Richards. She was assured that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but the way of life she described was basically military rule. They brought requests and suggestions to Richards, who had brought a handful of very well-equipped soldiers and lots of military hardware to the fold. It was a very tight ship they lived on, but they were protected, safe, and there was a plan. They were given a tent with camp cots and shown where to get washed up after their evening meal, and Steve had relaxed sufficiently to not feel the need to keep the gun close. Richards found them at breakfast and resumed his recruitment attempts. "I trust you slept safely?" he asked, wearing his rigid smile. Steve first thought it was a pretense, that Richards was more likely to force his will on people than respect an individual's choice. He was starting to realize that Richards was just a little awkward, and the smile was a bit of light social armor. "Fine, thank you," Steve said. "I'd like to get on the road as soon as possible, though." "I thought you would," Richards replied and turned over his shoulder. "Andrews!" he called out. Andrews came up and saluted before standing himself at ease. The slightly relaxed drill formality spoke of a compromise for efficiency in an otherwise tight military-run camp. Andrews was about Steve's height and build, but at least 15 years his junior, and he was dressed in camouflage fatigues like Richards and carrying a sidearm on his right leg. "All ready, sir," he said, nodding greetings to Steve and Emma. "Andrews here will see you safely to your destination. Not that I think you're incapable at all," Richards said with genuine humor in his eyes. They shook hands and promised to return with their answer on the way south. They followed Andrews out to the vehicles and saw a military Land Rover parked next to their own. Andrews put on a tactical webbing vest and loaded his rifle, a British Army issue SA-80 with a scope. He didn't ask for the destination, just got behind the wheel and waited to follow. Steve had to wonder whether they were being guarded or protected. Their journey resumed its normal pace as the weather closed in. This far north, they saw the damage that winter had caused to some of the roads. Huge potholes carved chunks of the roads away. Normal cars would struggle to negotiate some of the bigger bits of damage, and Steve guessed that nothing short of an off-road vehicle would be able to travel within 2 years in some places. They made a couple of stops. Both times Andrews was alert and capable, covering with his rifle and providing backup for Steve. When they finally stopped for the evening after a bumpy day's travel, Steve tried to get Andrews talking. He expected a brick wall of short answers, and was surprised when he opened up. His name was Mitchell. He preferred Mitch, but the military habit of surnames had stuck. He had never shed the bounds of Army service, despite the end of the world, and seemed fiercely loyal to Richards. He wasn't his captain. In fact, of the 8 Army personnel there, only one was from Richards's unit originally. Mitch was one of 6 trained infantrymen who had been cobbled together to form the blades of Richards's survival camp. "It's not that bad. We've had hard times and a few insurgent issues, but on the whole, it's good," he said genuinely.
And when the plan comes together, we'll be stronger and hopefully pick up more people on the way. It's no small task to get this many people across country nowadays.
True, it isn't, Steve agreed, sipping the coffee made on the cap stove. Tell me about this helicopter.
Airfield 50 miles from base. Chinook inside a hangar with some other fixed wings, Mitch replied.
Any other helicopters? Steve probed.
None. The Chinook seems to be in good nick, though. When we found it, we locked the place down tight for winter. It's been sealed up ever since then, so should be well preserved.
It'd need a full service. All the fluids would need changing, Steve said to nobody in particular, the thought of flying again clearly occupying his mind. Tell me about the insurgents you mentioned, he requested. Mitch explained about the raids, attempts to steal their supplies by a group in the night. They had captured some of them and offered them a place at the table so they didn't have to steal. Some of them took the offered inclusion, others didn't.
It went on for a few months. I think in the end we killed enough of them to make it too much bother, he finished.
Their own story wasn't too dissimilar to how Richards' camp had grown, the main difference being that this group's core was military with an established hierarchy, whereas their own was based more on a civilian government style. Both ways seemed to work. Richards had established a guard, trained capable civilians in weapon drills, fortified their position, and sent out scouts just as they had, and brought back more and more survivors. They hadn't encountered the same problems of having to liberate others from slavery, a story which intrigued Mitch mainly for the use of the big machine gun. And there seemed to be less resistance to their recruits here, perhaps due to the harsher terrain and the need for shelter taking over. The more they spoke, the more Steve wanted to form some link with this group. Not that he wanted to join, but more that he felt that he could in some way help them. He tried to convince himself it was something other than the lure of getting behind the controls of an aircraft. There are other airfields in Scotland, you know, Steve said. The facility. It took them another 2 days to find it. They did so just as the light was starting to fade after they had covered the same patch of ground repeatedly looking for it. No handy signposts gave directions to the secret biological weapons development lab. That might have caused local residents to write to their MPs. Not that there were any local residents, as the land was bleak and empty. The doors were unlocked, and the ship-style airlock door swung open with a groan after the locking wheel was spun. No electricity, as they expected, so they cleared the place as best they could with torches before finding the generator room deep underground. A jerry can of diesel and some encouragement finally sparked it up with a series of threatening, spluttering coughs. Slowly the lights began to blink on, and machines made whirring noises as they came to life. Steve and Mitch cleared the whole bunker, which was made up of ghostly labs and dusty glass doors. They found no trace of anyone there, and assumed that they too had abandoned their haven when the power ran dry. Emma was lost in a rare moment of introspection, wondering if there were a huddle of decaying scientists in a building nearby, having escaped to certain death and excruciating pain. Her reverie was disturbed by the two armed men declaring that their temporary home was devoid of life other than their own. They set up in the living quarters, using their own sleeping bags and discarding the duvets belonging to the former inhabitants. Water was boiled, food was prepared, and Emma formed a plan about the tests she wanted to run. Mitch gave her another sample of blood for her subject pool, and the lab was set to be reinvigorated the following day. The following morning, Steve tried to offer his help, but after the third polite refusal, Emma allowed her exasperation to show. "It will take me longer to explain the very basics of how to run a single test than it will to do it. Now please let me work," she snapped, softening her outburst with a smile and a drop of her shoulders. Truth was, she was very stressed. She knew where to start, but she didn't know where to end. Steve got the hint and said that one of them would stand guard while the other scouted the local area. Her analysis and comparison of blood samples between the immune and the now dead were the obvious initial places to look. She ran every kind of test she could, Hemoglobin levels, white cell count, potassium levels, enzymes, platelets, and a dozen other checks. Each sample was carefully catalogued and the results were recorded in a large notebook as well as on her voice recorder. After almost an entire day hunching over the worktop, running the same tests repeatedly, she finally gave in to her aching back and growling stomach. There was probably another 4 days left just doing the basics before she even started work on the microscopic analysis of each sample. She left the lab to find Steve. They were going to be there maybe 10 days, and the others needed to bring in supplies and more fuel. She found them both sitting in the communal area, decorated like an early 90s government canteen, and explained the time frame to them. Steve and Mitch looked at each other as though her declaration had touched upon a subject she wasn't aware of. Steve nodded to Mitch. "I'll go," said the soldier. "First thing in the morning, and should be back in 3 days. You stay local and look for food and fuel." Steve agreed, and he turned to Emma to explain. "During my service, I spent some time up here. It's one of the reasons I volunteered to come, but I didn't want to get anyone's hopes up by saying why," he said, almost cautiously. "There is another Air Force base just over 150 miles northeast. I'm hoping there is a smaller helicopter there that is preserved enough to get in the air. The Chinook is too big for me to fly alone, and the engineering required for it is extensive. Plus, I've never even been in the cockpit of one, as flying them was always done by dedicated squadrons. Something smaller like a Sea King or a Puma or a Merlin would be much easier, and I've flown them all enough to know a bit about their engineering requirements. I want to get in the air again if I can." Emma understood. In her own way, she was enjoying what she was doing now. She had an expertise, and this was probably the last time she would get to use it. Steve was a pilot, and he felt like he'd lost the use of his legs since he'd last flown. She raised no objection, and Mitch began preparing for a solo trip as they all pored over a large-scale map of the Highlands. Unlike their current location, the base would be well signposted, which would save a lot of searching. Steve planned to stockpile all the diesel he could find locally, having given Mitch his Land Rover for the journey, and Emma went back to her lab tests. Imminent arrivals. Dan relented and allowed the logistics crews to load enough baby equipment to last their growing colony for years. With all the powders and bottles and equipment, he reckoned they could raise kids for years, but still more was needed. Kate and her team wanted more and more medical equipment, and a return run to the hospital was suggested. Dan was not an advocate of ever visiting the hospital again, and was supported by Lexi as she absent-mindedly rubbed at the thick scars on her chest. Nobody had strayed far from home since Steve and Emma had left, and there was a slight air of anticipation about their expedition. Dan wondered why, as there could surely be no great revelations coming from the results. There could be no cure, nor was there anyone to be cured. They were what was left, and the only answers that could matter were the questions of how and why. On one of the morning tasking meetings, Joe and Lexi went out, and Leah asked Dan for a minute of his time. "I figured it out," she said. "What?" Dan asked, confused. "The tire-changing problem. You said I could go out alone if I could repair a flat tire. I figured it out." Dan had completely forgotten about her driving assessment and felt bad, as she had been so disappointed that she couldn't lift the spare wheel down. After her recent performance, he trusted her abilities, but was still reluctant to let her out alone, purely because he wanted to keep her safe. The tire problem was a good excuse to hide behind, until now. "Tell me," he said, worrying that she had indeed surmounted the last remaining obstacle to her freedom. "I've got a pump, and some of that stuff you inject in so the puncture fixes itself. The pump runs off the car, so I can repair a flat and get home without having to take the wheel off," she said proudly. As much as Dan wanted to find fault with it, she had presented a valid argument. He sighed with his head down, thinking. "Dan," she asked,